Sorry, I am trying to see if I could put some more light because it is sunny here in Seattle, which is a phenomenon. And so I don't look great. I don't look great. All right, almost. How are you? This is a good way to start the podcast. It's enjoyable to watch you fiddle around.
I'm good. I'm fine. Normal craziness. I'm excited to talk about this one.
In that I do think the concept as it relates to racialization for Latino people is super interesting. The topic is something that I have studied for ages. This is something I've delved deep into. And
so super excited about our guest today. And Laura's
UCLA,
work.
baby.
What did you say?
UCLA.
That's right. That's
California,
right.
baby.
That's right. Well, and her work, when I reached out to her, I was thinking about you because I know that this is an area of interest for you. Certainly for me as a former bilingual teacher, however, I don't have the cultural roots to really have that be even, I feel like it's more meaningful, or this is a good example, and I won't edit it out, for where leaders are like trying to figure out how to talk about race and do it in a clumsy way, and that's okay. So there it is. Tell me about your perspective, or just like how, my God, I'm still stumbling. Jamie, what'd you think?
being clumsy means you're growing, right? That's your brain getting better. You're wherever we struggle and we were like, I don't know how to say that. I don't know what to do.
Right.
That's
so
your
many
brain
of my
changing.
responses are very scripted. I know how to talk. And then when you are walking off the path a little bit and not sure, that's where you stumble. I agree.
Exactly. So,
oh my God.
yes, I am super excited to talk about this. This is something I've studied. So in some ways, my curious nature wasn't piqued here because I've done a lot of study around racialization in the United States, or racial identity in the United States. I speak to racial identity and understanding racial identity in schools. This is what I do for a living, not just race, though. I even contend to some degree, she talks about racial identity not being taught in schools, understanding the development of understanding race in the US, not really taught beyond the multicultural approach, which I believe is true. But I'm interested in the concept, and this concept related to what she said, and that is like the degree to which, do schools teach any form of identity? I don't really think so.
Other than that, what's in the curriculum is American identity. I mean, it still is in the state standards in many states. You've got to learn some of the patriotic songs. You've got to.
But it turns out also that there are plenty of Americans who don't know any American history. And so the concept of what identity is taught in school is really interesting. There are things that are experienced in school that form identity, but curricula that is specifically targeted to support a positive identity development, questionable.
Some schools, they'll have specialty elective classes, not as a system,
Yes.
but because it's a personal passion for a particular teacher who can then align it to English standards and English curriculum. And so kids take it in their senior year because they're looking for classes to take. So as part of the system establishing it, maybe not.
Yeah. Probably my Berkeley High, Joaquin went through Berkeley High. I've been connected to Berkeley High.
Berkeley High is an anomaly.
Full anomaly, 100%. But they would
cousins
counter
went to Berkeley
and
High.
say, we've had ethnic studies forever.
Right.
They've had African-American studies or Black studies forever. And so there are pathways to have that conversation at Berkeley High.
Well, I'd encourage you to find like Eric King's work. He's at the University of Buffalo in New York. And I got to know him a little bit. He has an annual conference around teaching African-American studies, Black history. And what I found incredible, having attended the conference twice, you would expect Black teachers who are finally feeling, oh my God, I've got this incredible space to explore curriculum and literature that I'm going to use in my classes. I was really heartened by the number of non-Black teachers who were also present because they want to learn and do better. So, and a number of elementary, who were like, how do I do this in a way that does not just keep doing the greatest hits, in terms of Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and, important history, but one that, as I think our guest, Dr. Laura Chavez Moreno would say, That's what people do every year after year. So, okay. So why don't we do this? Why don't we get into the conversation with Dr. Laura Chavez Moreno, and then we'll come back and then we'll debrief.
And
sound good?
Hash it up. Yeah, let's do it.
You know what I realized, though, is that recently we have not said who we are. And I was recently reminded of that by a listener who says, I have to go to your website to go see who you guys are, to look at the show notes.
Gracious. That's so funny. I say that we don't say it and that they have to guess which voice is which.
Why don't we just demystify? I'm Peter Stiefelman.
I'm Jamie Mansan.
You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question, because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools. Today on An Imperfect Leader, our guest is Dr. Laura Chavez Moreno, an award-winning researcher, qualitative social scientist, and assistant professor at UCLA in the departments of Chicano and Central American Studies and Education. She is the author of How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America, published by Harvard Education Press. Laura, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm excited to chat with you.
Yeah, I'm really excited to meet you. Your work is really very near and dear to my own heart and my struggle as an educator. I started my career as a third grade teacher, bilingual teacher, early exit bilingual model in Oakland, California. And I kept observing children who had switched between these tracks, English only to early exit to late exit, back to English. And they ended up not being proficient in either English or Spanish. I was so confounded by the system that I dug into Guadalupe Valdez's work, and I saw that she cited in your book as well. So that was exciting to see. And I wrote my own dissertation on how systems have everything to do with why children learn or don't learn English. And so my question is, you've mentioned that bilingual education, while often seen as anti-racist, can also contribute to the racialization of Latinx students. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, an example from your research in classrooms that really illustrates that this process beyond just the mere grouping of students by language.
Thank you so much. And that's an excellent question. And if I could start by saying what I mean by how schools make race, that would help in terms of answering your question. So what I mean by how schools make race, I mean that schools not only teach about race and racial ideas. For example, a teacher can explicitly have a lesson that teaches students about the differences between race and ethnicity, for example, or about slavery, etc. So those are lessons about race that are explicit. But schools make race through implicit ways also. So for example, what's being left out of the curriculum could also teach about what is worthy in terms of learning, in terms of racial groups, etc. But also schools make race through the policies and the practices that they engage in. And those policies could be, for example, testing students in order to then place them in tracked classes that offer a better curriculum than other classes. So that is in education called tracking. And those practices have been shown to be very racialized. So the students who are in the higher tracks will get a better curriculum, etc. And most of them will be, or the tendency is for them to be more white than, for example, even the rest of the school. So those are practices that also reinforce and teach about ideas that race exists and which racialized groups are better than others. And that's the idea behind the book also, that schools make race implicitly through having these type of practices that produce patterns in our society that then we're able to see as race or racial patterns. So that reinforces ideas about just our racialized groups in our society, that they exist and that they are racialized in hierarchy.
Yeah, so I think about in our high schools. We look at our AP courses or our IB courses, International Baccalaureate, and who is more likely to be in those classes. And if you go now downstream or upstream to see where things first started, it has everything to do with those types of tests that were established and created. So you look at your gifted programs and you say, how is it possible that only white and Asian students are in our gifted programs when you know there's brilliance among our Black and brown students? And then trying to find ways to disrupt those systems so that you can either expand your definition of intelligence, because if it's only linguistic and logical mathematical, and the linguistic one is what really trips up our second language learners because they haven't maybe had those experiences where they're building vocabulary from the very beginning. And so even in their first language in some cases. So I think that those are really interesting points. So then keep, please.
No, and I was going to tie my answer to the question in terms of bilingual education. And bilingual education, the program that I studied, even though it was a program that started with the intention to improve the academic achievement of the Latinx students, which in some cases it was doing, in the end, it was still reinforcing these patterns because sometimes it followed the different practices that the school or the district did in terms of, for example, tracking, in terms of testing, etc. So it was not able to escape those type of structures, and those type of structures are what ultimately create and reinforce these ideas.
Well, particularly in school districts that are trying to create like immersion programs as part of a magnet system, you begin to question what is the intent of these either dual immersion or dual language programs, because sometimes the intent is not about the improvement of the L1 students. It's about leveraging L1 students to help L2 students learn that second or other L1 students learn the second language. And so I'm sometimes struck by the intent or the intentionality behind why they chose a bilingual program in their school district. So at any rate, I've worked with a few school districts that are rethinking whether or not they want to continue to have those immersion programs because they were not, the very beginning of their foundation for creating them was about creating an enrichment opportunity for white families so that they wouldn't leave the district, as opposed to lifting up both those students whose primary language was, let's say, Spanish, and those who were learning Spanish. Does that at all resonate with some of the work that you've seen?
Yeah, definitely. In the study that I wrote about in the book, the program had that type of discourse also in terms of it being used in order to improve the achievement, like I mentioned earlier, of the Latinx population. But then the district also saw it as able to prevent white flight because a lot of middle-class white parents wanted their children to be bilingual. So the district advertised the program as that type of resource for parents to help with retaining white families in the district. So that was definitely present in this program that I studied.
Yeah. If you're just joining us on An Imperfect Leader, our guest today is Dr. Laura Chavez Moreno, an award-winning researcher, qualitative social scientist, assistant professor at UCLA, and the author of How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America. In the leadership model that I use to advise others, at the center of it all, at the core, is the goal of getting to deeper learning. And in the context of your work on how schools racialize Latinx, and I mean, even using the term Latinx, as you described in your book, requires analysis. And so in terms of how schools racialize Latinx students through bilingual education, and then considering my own model, it emphasizes this fostering of a culture of deep learning. And I wonder, how can educational leaders empower teachers to move beyond that superficial multicultural approach, right? And embrace the ambitious teaching, as you described, that's needed to critically address racialization in their classrooms?
Thank you so much for the question. And one of the things that I point to answer these type of questions in terms of what is needed in our education system, what is needed is a commitment to teach about race and racial issues throughout a student's career in for example, K through 12. And we haven't really as a society grappled with what that means in terms of the different grades and the differentiation that would need to happen. What's the scope of sequence in terms of learning about race? So what happened in the program that I studied, that meant that in the bilingual program, even though students were, I should mention that the students were in the program since they're elementary, and I studied the middle and the high school years. So what I noticed were that in the middle school and in the high school, both of the students were very interested in learning about race and racial issues. But in the high school, sometimes the students seemed very bored when the teachers were talking about race or doing some type of unit that had to do with that focus. And I wondered why that was the case. Why was it that when I interviewed students, they were very interested in learning about racial issues, but then that didn't really seem to be the case in terms of their engagement with the material when I was actually in the classrooms observing. And what I noticed afterwards was that what was happening was that the lessons that the students were being given were, like one student told me, were very repetitive. And they were repetitive in the sense that they were getting the same type of ideas that they would get, for example, in the elementary level, which was, for example, being racist is bad, don't judge people by their skin color, be inclusive, all these kind of lessons that in education we think of a multicultural sense of thinking about race. But in high school, I mean, and those are fine lessons to have, obviously. In elementary school, we definitely need them. The issue is that by the time that students were in high school, they had been hearing this. They already accepted it, I mean, to different levels, et cetera, but it was already a lesson that they had heard for sure. So they wanted another way of thinking about race that they weren't really getting from the program. So for leaders and for educators, that means that we have to think about racial learning throughout a student's school and not just stick with, for example, these multicultural ideas that in the book I called staying in Sesame Street, kind of, to just think about race in terms of just skin color and then just about being nice to others, as if racism is just about individual interactions. So we do need to progress students' thinking. And one of the things that I write about in the book is perhaps that includes, for example, learning about the process of racialization. How is it that in our society, the race is being reinforced in terms of racialized groups? And how is it that society makes groups in order to understand that they're not just something that's inherent in terms of of someone being a racial identity, for example? And again, to go back to what educators and, for example, superintendents could do is think about, for example, how we have a commitment to teaching math. So math is a subject that throughout the school years of the child, we can decide on what is being taught. For example, multiplication this year, et cetera. And then they progress through mathematical ideas to understand our mathematical world. So they don't get algebra, et cetera, in like early elementary. They progress into it, right? So that's the same thing that I think that we need to do in terms of understanding our society. Do we progress?
You're saying, how do I teach like the foundations of number sense that then leads to an understanding of how to do those basic operations that then lead to pre-algebra to calculus and geometry and beyond, right? So you're saying, in this case, okay, if you're in elementary school, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding, not trying to repeat back to you what you just said and be like, yeah, that's what I said, Peter. But rather, just to make sure I understand, is in elementary school, it's fine to do some of these really foundational work around belonging and understanding that sometimes our interactions are influenced by race and that racism is wrong. And then as you get to middle school and high school, to maybe even begin thinking about their own lived experiences and how the system has been set up or contributes to how racism exists and persists. So everything from in a financial literacy class that you might be taking to see why is it that in certain neighborhoods mortgage rates are higher than others, or why a bank account is not easily achieved, where is it, things like that in terms of like how you want to, because when I read was ambitious teaching includes embedding ethnic studies as well into the curriculum. And so I wanted to sort of better understand that.
Yeah, that's definitely right. And those are really good examples. And what I would just say is that we need to think about how to progress students' ideas about race and racism as also different things. So what's the difference between race and racism, for example, through their school careers, through their years in school? So I don't really know, like, for example, what would be taught in 5th grade versus like 7th grade, et cetera. Like that, I'm not sure. We as a society have to start thinking about what that would mean in terms of progressing students through these ideas instead of just sticking with the multicultural idea of race. And to be fair, some of the teachers that I observed in the program really did commit to teaching about racial ideas, racism, etc. The thing is that, again, there was not that much support for them, especially in terms of having materials in Spanish for them to draw from.
I'd like to ask you a question that I ask every guest who comes on the podcast. How does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Oh, thank you. That's a great question. And for me, an imperfect leader resonates because when I first heard it, I thought, oh, that's really great in terms of having people know that they're not always going to decide in ways that they're comfortable deciding, and they're going to regret some of their decisions. But I think that learning from those experiences makes us a better leader, and to also recognize that there is not a perfect leader. Everyone will have some blindnesses or some type of things that they wish they could have done better. So for me, it resonates a lot because of my work also with thinking about just teaching. We're never going to be the perfect teacher. So the same thing goes for we're never going to be the perfect leader.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being. And I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest today is Dr. Laura Chavez Moreno, assistant professor at UCLA and the author of How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America. And in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct the decisions they made, and then we discuss it. So, Laura, what happened?
So I'll start from something that I describe in the book. So in the book, I described that I was in the community going to, like I mentioned earlier, classrooms. I was also interviewing teachers. Something I didn't mention was that I was also going to meetings of the community to talk about education issues, to talk about Latinx issues. And I also went to meetings that specifically were focused on the bilingual education program that I was observing. So I went to those. And in those meetings, a lot of the parents who were there were voicing that they really wanted teachers who were perfect Spanish speakers, who were 100% bilingual, who knew the culture and who knew Spanish perfectly, etc. So this focus on being a perfect bilingual speaker, etc., that was the focus of parents in terms of what they wanted their teachers to be. And some of the teachers there were present. So I knew that was a big focus on it. Myself, having training in language and bilingualism, I know that's not really something, in my point of view, something to be desired, because 100% bilingualism for teachers, for anyone, for example, I consider myself bilingual. Am I 100% bilingual in all contexts and all situations? No. And I think that asking that of teachers and having the idea of this idealized bilingual person is very problematic. So having said that, then let me move on to the interaction that happened. So already having known that was kind of like a discourse that was around in the community, I was with a teacher who was also present in the other meeting. But I didn't, at the moment that this was happening, I didn't really relate it to that other meeting, just to give a little bit of context. But what happened was I was observing the teacher, and then after the observation, I sat down with the teacher just to kind of like chit chat. And I didn't expect the teacher to ask me anything that she asked me. So I'll mention that she asked me, okay, she got a notebook and she asked me like what she noticed in terms of what she could improve in terms of her Spanish. And that took me aback a little bit because I wasn't in the classrooms observing whether teachers spoke perfect Spanish or not. That was not my intent at all. So it wasn't something that I had really documented in a way. I hadn't really, like, my mind when I was in the classroom was not there. So I was like, well, I don't know. And then she said that she asked me for feedback. So then I felt, again, given my training in Spanish, given my training in like bilingualism, and then also not adhering to an idealized Spanish or an idealized English, I answered to her something to the effect of, well, I think students need to learn and hear all different types of Spanishes, which is what I thought, what I still believe, that students need to hear all different types of Spanishes. And I don't think that we should just be censoring like, oh, this type of Spanish is perfect, so then they can hear it. I don't believe in that. But my response to her, when I said this to her, her response was very emotional, and she told me something to the effect of, that's the worst answer you could have given me, almost in tears. And then I also teared up because I didn't expect that to be her response. So for me, it was then also very emotional. So in that situation, the decision that I made was to be quiet. I didn't respond again. I didn't really know. I felt that I didn't know how to handle the situation that was, for both of us, very emotional. And language is so personal also. And I know that she was a very committed teacher, and she was one of my favorite teachers to visit. So it was very interesting to me to have this interaction and not really know how to respond. And I still think about it now, and I wish I would have done this. I wish I would have done that. But in the sense of like the personal interactions that people have when conducting a study, sometimes we're researchers, but we're not really trained to or have the personal capacity sometimes to be able to understand like what is needed at that point.
Right. So yeah. So for those who are listening, I'm going to put it in the context of a superintendent, because our work absolutely is about giving feedback. If you're in a large district, it may be the assistant superintendent for curriculum instruction who's giving that kind of feedback, because they may engage in clinical supervision where they're really truly giving feedback to the instructional practices of the teachers in their classrooms. For your perspective, the work that you were doing, you had a very different focus, and then you were being asked to give feedback for a different purpose. And you, no doubt, and we'll get to the question of what did you learn about relationships. Here, I imagine that the teacher, as you felt fondly for them, they had a similar feeling of safety and probably why they wanted to ask you questions, but then it didn't go the way that you might have thought it was going to. And so for those who are listening, I'm thinking to myself, wow, we are constantly in public spaces where we're having conversations, then we're accessed personally for feedback. And sometimes when we think about those experiences, what got overlooked was just thinking about or being prepared for those radically different conversations we're about to have. What would you say got overlooked in your interaction with this educator in particular?
Well, that's difficult for me to say in terms of what was overlooked. I think that I wish that I would have been more cognizant of of what to say in response and to clarify my meaning. So I think that would have been better. And sometimes I wonder if it would have helped. So perhaps that's the thing that comes to mind.
What did you learn about relationships?
Yeah, it's interesting because although I feel that I had a great relationship with the teacher, I think that after that experience, I think that both of us were also a little bit more weary of each other than we would have. So I wish that relationships are always, especially in the sense of the different positionalities in terms of also the different positions that one has in the role of, for example, a researcher visiting a classroom looking for feedback. Those type of relationships are also, especially because we had just met that school year. I mean, it's a pretty weak relationship in the sense of, although we were, like you mentioned, perhaps fond of each other in some ways, it was not strong enough to be able to overcome that type of interaction.
Yeah. As you were describing it, and I thought about the role of researchers, and most qualitative researchers are very aware of the idea of reflexivity, right? That our own presence changes the dynamic of what we're seeing. And so we just have to be aware of that. And so here, the relationship may have been not totally familiar you were aware that your presence changes the dynamic of instruction and relationship and those type of things. And meanwhile, here was an educator who saw somebody who might give them feedback and then didn't respond maybe in the most appealing of ways. As you look back on this, what could you have done differently?
Oh, yeah. I wish that I would have been able to elaborate.
Sorry, you're
more.
like, oh, yeah. I mean,
yeah. I wish I would have. Yeah. I wish I would have been able to explain my answer, perhaps change the way that I had worded it, for sure. Yeah. Or even if not at that moment, I wish that I would have been able to, like a day or two later, be able to approach the topic. But I just wasn't able to because it took me a long time to kind of make sense of it.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, as you started this conversation about describing that second meeting, it all stems from this first meeting of parents fervently saying how they want perfect bilingual teachers, and even having a shared understanding of what does that mean, perfect? Because as you described in your response, there are different Spanishes, and there are different, you want someone who's competent in Spanish at all, but you also want someone who understands child development, and you want to understand milestones in learning a language and how to, particularly if the child and depending on the bilingual model that school is using, knowing at what point to make those transitions and things like that. So I think your response, while it wasn't received as you had intended, was appropriate. So I was just kind of curious. In the end, though, I mean, as you look back, there's always, through our learning and our experiences, something good comes out of the experience. While it's still on your mind, so that means it's still somewhat heavy on your heart, there's still something that's good that comes out of that situation. What would you say was the good that came out of it? Other than your book.
Well, I mean, that little part is like a side, not a side, but it's not the main focus of the book in terms of that kind of interaction. But one thing that I think was good from it was that I was able to think about also more deeply in terms of my own interactions with the teachers in the study. And then I was also, these type of situations always have one grow, especially if one reflects, right? So because of the reflection that I went through, I think that it does help me in terms of being able to, how would I say, interact with others in a better way in the future.
I think about superintendents who will go to a school. The school will be doing a data conference that you'll be sitting down. They'll have their lead teachers and the principal, and everybody will be sort of talking about, here are the goals that we set at the beginning of the year, and we're giving progress on how we're doing. And we have to be keenly aware of our position. So you in your position as researcher, so you're seen as this authority that's going to give feedback, and they're going to, and for a superintendent, they're seen as the authority on achievement and being able to bless the good work that they're doing and also provide additional expertise, perhaps. And we have to be mindful of that it's the title, not necessarily the person, but it's the title that they're looking to. And so walking into this conversation being at least having some prepared remarks or ways of engaging to elevate their work and allowing them to maybe do some carrying of that and not just being seen as the authority. I don't know if that makes sense or
Oh yeah, that makes great sense. And thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's always good to hear also. And even though perhaps someone may know that, it's good to hear it. So thanks for sharing, Peter.
What advice would you give to an aspiring leader? So now, you wrote a book that really is about schools and school systems using teachers as the vehicles, but they ought to be read by their principals, their superintendents, their school boards and policymakers as they think about this work. And so as you are now continuing to do this work and talking to, throughout the world about this important work, what advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
Oh, I think this is advice that I give teachers also, and it's to recognize that we're not all going to know everything, and to know that, for example, riffing from your title, that they will be imperfect leaders, that they will be imperfect educators, and for them to be able to learn with, for example, in the case of educators, to be able to learn with their students, and if they're leaders, to perhaps be able to also learn with the people they're leading, the teachers or the staff, etc. So one thing that I'm thinking of is being transparent in the sense of I'm learning with you. I think that would be a good step to take.
Our guest today was Dr. Laura Chavez Moreno, an award-winning researcher, qualitative social scientist, assistant professor at UCLA, and the author, I don't know if you can see in my book, there it is, I just disappeared, and the author of How Schools Make Race, Teaching Latinx Racialization in America, published by Harvard Education Press. And Laura, I'm just so grateful that you gave me some time today. I wrote some notes around being mindful of both the explicit and the implicit way that we think about and talk about race, the difference between race and racism, and one is actionable, one is being mindful and understanding, and then just thinking about the policies and practices that all leaders should be considering as they think about all their students, not some, as they think about their programs, who's in them, who's prioritizing them, how do we make sure that we really are working towards a more inclusive community. So thank you so much for your time. I really am grateful for it.
Thank you so much, Peter. I've enjoyed our conversation, your questions, and the way that you divided the segments. And if I could share where readers or where
oh my gosh, thank you for doing the job that I did. I'll do my own part too, where I do my own analysis of where I fell short. What did I overlook? How about asking the author where to find the book and where to find you?
Oh, no worries. Yeah. The book can be found in all major bookstores. So, for example, Barnes & Noble, Bookshop. You could also find it in the press's website, Harvard Education Press. And I would also ask listeners to please ask your local library, your public library or bookstore to purchase the book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll make sure that information's in the show notes as well. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you too.
We are back. Thank you so much for listening. I actually want to jump in if it's all right.
Please,
This idea.
please.
Okay. So this idea of different Spanishes, I almost actually felt relieved when she said that, almost
Yeah,
like
me too.
permission that I might have a level of expertise and an advanced level in a certain area. The Spanish that one uses in a school setting, an education setting. Can I tell you a funny story about how it was revealed?
Yeah.
I mean, how I might consider myself bilingual, but then in certain areas, not at all.
Right. Yeah.
So our
go for
first,
it.
okay. So our first kid is born, and we're at the hospital, and I decided that it's probably a good idea, or we decided it's probably a good idea that I attend a breastfeeding class. And so the hospital was putting on a breastfeeding class, and so I went to the class, and it was me and the nurse who was teaching the class, and a couple, and the couple only spoke Spanish, and they couldn't find a translator. And they look at me, they go, "Do you speak Spanish?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Okay, great. So do you mind translating?" And I'm like, "Oh." And so she's talking about like latching on, and I'm trying to explain to this woman. And so like for the word nipple, I didn't know the word. So I'm just going, el punto de pecho, like the point of the breast.
I was thinking, were you going to use the latch of the door? La puerta.
Punto de pecho. So it's an ongoing joke in this family about punto de pecho. So, and I'm looking at the one like, do you understand? And she's, I know what you're saying, but this is incredibly embarrassing. For you, not for me. So multiple Spanishes totally felt relieved. Oh yeah, that's the case.
You know, actually, that made me come up with a question that I thought was kind of interesting. I mean, I liked Dr. Chavez Moreno's response here in that, yeah, there are multiple Spanishes. What are you talking about? Because there is no perfect. And it had me brainstorming about the concept of perfect, any perfect Spanish or perfect speaker. And I'm like, well, I don't think it's about what that means, because I think we'll both counter that with there isn't such a thing. And you're talking about communication at multiple levels.
Especially on a podcast called An Imperfect Leader. So
Exactly. So that made me think, actually, let's ask this question. Who is the perfect American English speaker? Or who would you call up? When you think of, perfect speaker, who is that?
Oh, that's a great, yeah. And I would say, I don't know who that person is. I would say,
What are you
though,
talking about?
you put me on a construction site in English and I'm going, what does that thing do? Or that looks sharp, or I don't know. In fact, I still don't know how a toilet works. You know, someone says, well, can you explain how a toilet works? No. And people go, of course you do. I go, okay, tell me, how does a toilet work? And they go, well, you flush it. And I go, then what happens? So for those listening, like there's no perfect English, no perfect Spanish. There are scenarios for which one has competence and just the opposite is incompetence.
I went straight away from I'm like competence, which is the one that makes me, that is most enjoyable to me.
So okay,
I still like Matthew McConaughey talking, I gotta say.
Oh, God. Matthew McConaughey, while he's acting, because some of those lines. So,
goodness gracious. That
So
kind of
let me ask
stuff
you
just
this,
brings
though.
me joy.
that's fantastic. So let me ask you this, though, about the conversation, because, you know, that was in the context of parents at a community meeting or a school meeting saying that they wanted their teachers to be perfectly bilingual and perfect Spanish. And she was really sort of helping everyone recognize like there is no perfect Spanish. And then she's in a classroom with a teacher who's asking for feedback on her Spanish. And also Dr. Chavez Moreno says, you know, there are many kinds of Spanish kind of thing. And I'm less interested in the teacher responding, that's the worst answer I've ever. And poor Laura is, you know, also just really affected by that exchange and clearly is still thinking about it. And I'm grateful that she shared it with us. I'm curious because you are a coach who works all over the country with school districts, with school leaders, with teachers, and, you know, leaders at every level.
About all of this.
So tell me, so preach. What advice do you have for those who are doing this work? Or what was your takeaway?
The desire to answer the question overwhelmed Laura. So the question is honest. Do you have any feedback for me? You have to start that particular interaction with what kind of feedback would be helpful. She answered it as opposed to figuring out what's the outcome that this person is looking for. You've got to be curious about what it is where that person's brain is going, where they're thinking. And I don't think most leaders sit in that. Rather, they sit in a place of, and me, I do this too. I shouldn't say outside of me, of solving problems. We get stuck in this pattern of question, answer, as if everything has a solution. And there isn't. That solution may or may not work, even if your description of the toilet works in one particular way. But actually, there are innovations in the use of a toilet that cause for different toilets to work differently. This is why Japanese toilets are better. American toilets kind of suck.
Japanese toilets also sing a song, as you approach.
Exactly. It's everything. It's wonderful.
And if you're not actually, I don't know if
maybe I can get one to talk to me like Matthew McConaughey.
Oh my! Well, you need encouragement. You're doing great. You're doing great. Keep it up. You've been in here a while.
All right.
Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Well, I was thinking that in public spaces, in a bus station or a train station in Japan, that there's a button on the toilets to play music, so that have that kind of privacy and can be somewhat discreet. And I'm like,
that's funny.
Wow,
that's
so thoughtful. Yeah. So thoughtful.
So I do want to say also related to some of the other concepts that she brought up, there's tons of curriculum. If people are really, when she said we haven't wrestled with as a country how to teach racial identity, that I agree with. But have people thought about it? Oh yeah, a lot, forever. This has been a topic of scholarly study for eons. And I can give some very good, easy, accessible tools right away that would at least give you the contextual knowledge for understanding everything that she sort of mentions: race, the difference between race and racism, the difference between levels of racism, individual or institutional versus structural. I have 3. The first one is anything produced by the Kirwan Institute out of Ohio State, or for Ohioans, the Ohio State University. John Powell's work at the Kirwan Institute really did a good job of better understanding the concept of structural racialization, which is different from institutional racism, which is different from individual racism. And what she references is this idea that what he speaks to, his quote is, "You can produce racist outcomes without racist actors." That's structural. It's built into the society, into the way in which we operate. You guys talked about one in relation to mortgages. So that's number 1. Number 2, there's a video series, amazing documentary series. It's old now, called Race, the Power of an Illusion. It's a 3-part series, and it was produced by PBS and POI. The first one is about the genetics of race, so understanding the concept of the science of race. The second one's about the history of race as it relates to the U.S. And then the third is the current context of race in the U.S. And they give probably one of my favorite foundational understandings of how race, racial identity, racism plays out currently in the United States. And then last, this is directly related to Dr. Chavez Moreno's work, and that is a podcast, Nice White Parents, that was produced by Serial recently. And that was relatively recently, I don't know, a few years ago, where they followed the creation of a French bilingual school in a school in the Bronx. I think it's the Bronx. And talk about best for whom, to your point about the white, magnet schools.
Yeah, I was going to say, we talk about that. I'm glad that you bring it back up or re-elevate that conversation. And she does too, about what was the original intent and then how it has morphed into these privileged.
I highly recommend people listen to this podcast series if you can access it. It gives these are real people. This is a real situation.
Those are all fantastic resources. No, one of the things I'm thinking about that she noted, and I know there's got to be people doing this work as well, is, when it comes to like scope and sequence of this work, is how do you build in the early elementary years around pride, and then you might have these culminating events of, a multicultural fair or something like that in those early years, in terms of that's around belonging, right? And then how do you then transition as you get to upper elementary? What are the readings that children can do and the kind of conversations that teachers can have around racial identity? And then the middle school piece. And then in high school, embedding within social studies curriculum as well as elective courses like your children had access to at Berkeley High. And I think that is an aspiration that she was sort of craving to see, and where she said, I don't know about scope and sequence when it comes to this, and then tried to then move into problem solving as opposed to your advice of take a step back and ask the teacher, what are you hoping? What kind of feedback are you hoping at?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's so interesting too, as a Latino, racialization for Latino is different than racialization for other people. But that's true for every group. because this goes back to race, the power of illusion, history of race. There are only two racial categories in the United States. There are only two. And this is a controversial idea because people's identity, I'm separating the concept of your own personal identity and the actual categories of race. There is, in the US, we have white and not white. Those are the two categories. That's it. And that's because the category of white was created here. We were the first country, the first place to ever use that particular moniker. Different from, say, for example, Caucasian or other identifiers that were related to white racial groupings, but they weren't specifically the term white. This shifts everything.
Okay, because I was going to say, you can go all the way back to Aristotle where there's, where white was good and black was bad. And, so.
100%. 100%. There's 1,000 different ways.
But like a census type of government sanctioned white, non-white.
Correct. Government sanctioned identifier to describe the citizenry. And this, truthfully, the reason for it was, how do we get English and French to unite colonies, English and French colonists to unite against indigenous population in the US? Because it turns out the English and the French don't love each other. And you have to have something in common. Can't be religion. They all came here for different religions. So, plus you can't tell, looking at your farm across the way, whether you're like me or not. What's a common trait that unites us where I can just look at you and know you're on my team versus not that team? And that's where it starts. But with unintentionally creating the other category, right? If you create white, you unintentionally create every other category. And that's why you see that all the different racial terms for different people of color is because of government, history, personal interest in naming ourselves, on and on, forever and ever and ever and ever. Political movements, all of those play a role. That's why there's 1,000 categories. Go to our current U.S. Census. There's 1,000 categories for all of us. Because I'm like, well, my mama can't see herself in certain terms. She doesn't go to Latinx. My mama has to have Chicana written there. It has to say Chicana. Otherwise, she doesn't see herself.
Wow. And even, 20 years ago, the census would say select one. Now it allows you to select more than one. My wife, who's biracial, they would say, well, which one are you more?
You're like, what?
That's the one you select.
That's so good.
Works.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah. But see, this is why I love it so much. I mean, I'm laughing.
I said that to her.
Suspicious. But what a great example too. I laugh because of the absurd.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Of race. It's absurd and real at the same time. They're crazy, and it happens, and it causes a genuine impact on people's lives.
I have to tell you, I was thrilled to have this conversation with Dr. Chavez Moreno because I really believed that it was going to be a great vehicle for some of the being able to harvest your wisdom and your knowledge. And often each week, I feel like you have all of this to share, and the conversation doesn't necessarily call for us to be able to really tap into it. So this was really great.
And if you ever want to talk, actually, I'll say this to the audience. If the audience ever wants to talk more about this or dig into it, or even to come at me and say, actually, I was thinking about this resource instead of that one, or anything. Like, this is my passion. I love talking, and not just racial identity, because identity is multifaceted. We're all the things all the time.
Well, that's an excellent thing to put into the show. If you're going to leave a comment as you give us 5 stars, you could say, you can also look for this resource. So, Hey, thank you so much. I'll see you next week.
Yeah, I'll see you next week. Take care.
You've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruba doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.